Hi everyone, welcome to Tales of Dread. In this story, a firefighter and his crew are out putting out a forest fire when they come across a house in the middle of nowhere. But that's not all he comes across. Keep watching. This is his story. If you just found this channel, please subscribe, click that bell, give that thumbs up, and tell a friend. I could probably tell you about 100 different things. I've seen some crazy things while putting out fires. You may have heard this before, but when you're in the middle of the fire and it's almost laughing at you as you try to beat it back, I swear to God, it's like, it's a living thing. I've been doing this for about 10 years, but nothing scares me more than what I saw in late summer 2018. It was around the middle of August, and this looked like it was going to be the worst wildfire we had fought so far. Just outside of Fresno, I was a member of the National Forest Hotshots. I work mostly as an EMT. I don't fight fires as a volunteer as much as I used to, but I still do it on the side. I also help train new firefighters by sharing my knowledge and experience with them. Even though this experience almost made me quit my job for good, I couldn't just walk away from it. I've been 4 stories up into the guts of a building that was falling apart, and I even helped a kid climb out of a well. As cliché as that sounds, many kids and even some adults who should know better by this point don't let their curiosity get the best of them. I don't think I or anyone I know at work has ever had to get a cat out of a tree. Still, that doesn't mean it doesn't happen. Of course. Still, no matter what I've seen in the 10 years I've been doing this, nothing compares to this one. Not for me, anyway. We were on our way to the scene in the early afternoon. There were 15 of us, and we were going to meet up with the crew that had been out there since the night before. We wanted to help them out and stay ahead of the fire. As we walked along, talking about digging ditches and cutting wild brush, we heard a panicked voice on the radio. It could have been because of the fire, the weather, or how far into the woods we were. We could barely understand what they were saying, but it was clear that they were pretty scared. Elizabeth Parker, who was one of our newer members and who we called Lizzie or just Parker, tried to call someone on her cell phone to find out what was going on when thick plumes of black smoke started to blow through the trees around us. We didn't need more information to figure out what was going on because, from what I could tell and from what I had heard long after the sun went down, the fire had suddenly changed direction and was coming right at us. Wildfires are most likely to start at that time of day. When the sun is out, the humidity is low and the wind is strong. This makes the weather much harder to predict. You can't always beat a fire at its own game. When I was young, the chief used to say that I was as green as a cucumber, and he was right. I did a head count as soon as the thick grey cloud rolled in. I came up 3 short. In the end, they realized that Parker, GRE, and Jackson were missing. All of them were pretty new to the team. So I had to assume they were scared and ran away, but I didn't have time to go look for them. We weren't going to be able to outrun this jerk, and we had no chance of beating it back. So we had no choice but to set up our fire shelters right here and now. They didn't seem like much since they were made of aluminium foil on the outside and a heat-reflecting silica weave on the inside, but they could work in a pinch. We were in a tight spot, for sure. I tried to keep my voice from shaking too much as I quickly went over the steps, which we should all know by heart: open the carrying case, pull out the shelter, and shake it open. Step into it, pull it over your head, and tie it down with your face close to the ground, where the air is cleanest and coolest. Use your elbows, knees, and feet to hold down the shelter to stop the fire's winds, which could reach up to 60 miles per hour. Maybe I was saying these instructions to calm my own fear at the time, but it seemed to calm some of the crew as well, or at least it seemed that way to me, since the air was already thick. By the time we fell to the ground, We were huddled together like a whole neighborhood of igloos. If I had to describe it, which I guess I do, since I chose to write about it, I think it would feel like what a frozen dinner does in the first 30 seconds or so of being heated in a microwave. I could feel the almost unbearable heat coming over me, and I could hear the debris falling from the trees as it showered over us. Even though it was only a few minutes, it felt like I was stuck in that glorified aluminium foil for hours. I could feel my skin burn from the fire and bruise from the falling debris, and I could hear the fire engulfing us and making whooshing sounds. I heard some of the crew screaming. A couple yelled that they couldn't take it anymore, which made me almost bark at them that they couldn't leave their shelters under any circumstances. I knew that if any of them got out of their cocoons, their lungs would immediately fill with burning smoke, putting an end to their lives quickly and painfully. I could only hope they could hang in there. When the raging fire was finally over, I slowly moved my shelter away, letting my clothes and pieces of burned wood fall to the ground. We knew this was probably the first wave we had survived, so we worked quickly to put out the patch fires we could while trying to move farther away before the next one hit. These shelters could handle a lot, but I didn't want to put them to the test any more than I had to. Not only that, but I still hope we can find our missing crew. They got scared, which is something that anyone could do. But I prayed to everything I believed in that they had remembered their training and set up their shelters before it was too late. As we tried to stay close together as we moved farther away, blackened and dead trees kept dropping branches and splinters of wood all around us, causing us to get more and more separated. I told the people I didn't want to lose track of to take cover before the next wave came, but I only heard a few scattered answers. In just a few seconds, I could feel the warm smoke coming from behind me as I desperately looked around for another head count. Either I went down the wrong path or everyone else did, but I ended up by myself. The first wave didn't reach the area I was running through, which was a miracle, but I kept shouting for anyone who could hear me even though the only answer I got was that familiar distant whooshing. I hope the crew found a good place to land before they got here. I turned my head back one time and saw the orange glow of the wave coming toward me. A long way. I knew I had to set up my shelter soon, but when I saw a single cabin a few yards in front of me, I started to feel scared. I took the water out of my pack, lifted my mask, and tried to clear my throat enough to call into the small wooden cottage while pounding on the door to see if anyone was still inside. For seconds that seemed like hours, all I could hear was the fire getting closer. I gave a heavy sigh, hoping that the cabin really was empty, and then decided to move on and find a good place to deploy. When I walked around the building side, when I heard a shrill scream from inside, almost all of the blood in my face drained down to my stomach and made it churn. I didn't have much time because the angry orange glow coming from behind me was getting closer by the second, but I couldn't let anyone inside die in this fire. Since this wasn't the first time I'd ever broken down a door, it only took me 2 single swings of my axe to break it down. Between the heat, which made me sweat like a river, and the smoke in the room, my mask was cloudy. But I could tell from where the screams were coming. When I found a door that seemed to lead to a basement, I had to break it down because it had more locks than the door that led into the house. I can't imagine why someone would be hidden in such a way, but I didn't need to spend any time thinking about the many questions I was starting to have. When I finally got through that door, the shrill screams were much louder than they had been before. My heart was beating fast and my mask was foggy. When I got to the bottom floor, I was in such a hurry that I almost fell down the steep stairs. When I saw the source of the scary screams that led me to this old cabin, I could hardly believe my eyes. It took me a while to recognize her because she was in such a bad shape. But Parker had been stripped naked and tied to a chair with leather belts around her arms, legs, and torso. I couldn't think of who could have carved the complicated symbols and ruins into almost every part of her body that I could see. But the blood that was coming out of her wrists was what made me worry more. The wounds looked fresh, but I knew how quickly they could lose all of their blood. First, I cut the straps off her arms, which gave me the freedom to stop the blood from flowing out of her wrists. She was covered from head to toe in blood, and it was clear that she was in shock and getting weaker by the second. Not only that, but that sound was coming closer from outside the walls. With every minute I spent trying to set her free. I didn't notice the blood on the floor until I was cutting the straps around her shins. The blood was coming from her torn wrists. I knew I had to get us out of there, even though I couldn't help but follow the two grooves on the floor to the center of the room, where there was a 5-pointed star. It could just be the orange light from the narrow windows near the ceiling that makes the pentagram look like it's almost glowing from its own light. But when Parker barked my name and got me to pay attention to what was going on, I had to put my curiosity aside. The last strap around her middle didn't take me too much longer to cut. But time was not something we could afford to waste. When I saw that Liz had left her clothes and equipment near the back wall, we both worked quickly to get her ready to leave. She was still a little shocked and frantic, but she still had her instincts, even if it was the panic that made her run away before I could give her the answer. Most people would be close to brain dead after going through what she did, but not Elizabeth Parker. I hope that if we make it through this, she will be able to tell me who did this to her. But those had to be put off. When we got to the ground floor, the outside walls were already smoking, and the fire was raging right outside the open front door. We were glad to see that things weren't as bad in the back of the building, but we knew that wouldn't last. Even though she was weak from losing blood, she moved almost as quickly as she could with a full tank. We busted through the back door and drove as fast as we could, because my oxygen was running low. As soon as we saw the riverbank, Liz started setting up her shelter and reminded me to do the same while hers was still new. Mine had already survived the first wave, but I hoped and prayed that it could handle another one. Even though I was half tempted to just jump into the water, I did what the book said and put my face back to the ground and the safety of what I thought was a TV dinner. Our screams became one as the fire engulfed our flimsy coffins. A distant explosion told me that the cabin probably had some things that could catch fire inside. I didn't doubt that the small cottage would have made it through this, but I had hoped that it would still be there so that it might be possible to find some clues. Maybe my mind was just looking for something to take my mind off the fact that my skin felt like it was cooking while Parker still shrieked from next to me. But I could only imagine how badly her fresh wounds were burning at that point, compared to the sunburn-like feeling I had gotten from the first wave. I was mostly whole, but one of my crew members was bloody and almost without blood at the time. Still, given what we had already been through, I really did not think we would make it through this. Not with how bad it was getting by the time we got out of the cabin and heard a deep, haunting scream from somewhere far away. I almost had to go to the bathroom. Something about those horrible wails made them sound both painful and angry. I thought at first that my shelter was falling apart and that the sound was coming from my eardrums melting. After I was sure I wasn't going to be a Thanksgiving turkey, I had another thought. Was that the fire itself yelled in anger while we stopped it with our cocoons? Maybe it ate all the wood and stone it could and is now hiding. Was denying it? The meat, if you want it. Irrational? Maybe, but I wasn't feeling very logical at the time. Even with the angry waves all around me and the trees breaking and cracking, sending more debris over my fragile body, I became aware of one more sound that made my bladder feel like it was going to burst. Even though I knew the fire was raging outside my thin shelter. I was sure that the approaching footsteps I heard couldn't belong to anyone or anything. I tried to convince myself that the strange way my heart was beating was just my fast heart beating against the inside of my ears, but that didn't explain how it was getting closer. By the second, it felt like someone was wrapping their fingers around my shelter from the outside. I was sure it was going to break, and the fumes would burn my lungs. I soon screamed louder than I had ever done before. Even more. So when Parker made another high-pitched squeal from next to me, part of me wanted to break out of my chains so I could save her before the fire burned me, but I knew there was nothing I could do because the situation looked hopeless for both of us. I didn't pay much attention to the sounds of the scooper above me or the ground crew coming closer, but when that first blast of water rained down on me, I can't even think of a way to describe how it felt. As voices called out from all around me, everything became a blur. I slowly pulled myself out of my hiding place. Almost everything I saw was black and burned, but some of the faces I knew and some I didn't. Even though I wasn't thinking straight and my eyes were swollen, I managed to get the attention of some of the other people there so I could get Parker some help. When I and a few other boys finally got her to safety, the fire was almost out of control. On the way to the hospital, I stayed with Liz because they told me I should get checked out, too, since I'd been burned pretty badly in the last hour or so. I could hardly believe that everything happened in such a short amount of time, but I guess that's how trauma works. We both had questions to answer over the next few days, when Parker was up to it. I couldn't tell them much because I got to that cabin in the middle of nowhere because of luck and a fire. Parker didn't have much to say either. From what she remembered, she ran away as soon as she saw Gray and Jackson trying to get away from the coming fire, just as I had thought. She followed them, either because she thought they knew something she didn't or because she was scared. She didn't know, but it wasn't something she was proud of, no matter what. Tough as nails Parker. However, anyone can lose it in similar situations, so no one looked at her differently because of it. She must have been running as fast as she could when something hit her or shocked her. Whatever it was, it knocked her out cold, and when she woke up, she was right where I had found her. She had no idea who had cut the many wounds into her skin. Gray and Jackson were found about 20 yards west of the cabin. Since they had been burned up by the fire, it was thought that they had just failed to get out of the way in time. When the pathologist saw that the back of their heads had been hurt, that wasn't brought on by the fire. It would be safe to assume that whoever had attacked Parker had also gotten rid of them. I'm happy to say that the rest of my crew made it through that wildfire with nothing worse than second-degree burns, bumps, bruises, scrapes, etc., just like I did. There were other people out that day who were in much worse shape when they left the woods than we were. But, when you think about it, things could have been a lot worse. Over the next few months, I spent a lot of time at the hospital with Parker as she went through a number of painful procedures. Given how deeply those symbols were carved into her, she still has some scars, but we never found out what any of them meant. She and I have looked into all kinds of foreign and even ancient dialects, but we haven't found anything that sounds like the words she still sees in the mirror, whether it's because of what happened that day or the months we've spent together since then. During that time, we got closer. We will soon have been together for 2 years. Even though she took my last name, I still call her Parker, which she makes sure I don't forget. It just seems weird to call her by any other name. Even after everything, we moved out to a smaller town a couple of years back. She's still working, but I'm not as involved in most of the action these days. I still sometimes get right in the middle of things. Plus, some of the things I've seen in my job as an EMT are almost as strange as what brought my wife and I together. Even though we never found out who took Parker during the wildfire, those are stories for another time. But I can't help but wonder if the fire led me to her in some way. It's insane. I know, but after fighting the monster for so long, we might have grown to respect each other a little bit. I think about it often even now. What we went through that day. Maybe that's why I've come up with such clever ways to explain what happened. Even though, against all odds, we made it through that fire. When I hear those footsteps getting closer in my dreams, I sometimes wake up in a cold sweat. Those sounds are much more memorable to me than the waves of the fire around us. I guess I'll never know if they came from my mind when I was literally hot under the collar. But sometimes I still wonder if that fire really did bring me to the cabin that day. Could it also have been afraid of what caused what happened to Parker? After all, someone once said, "The enemy of my enemy is my friend." Well, I hope you all liked the story tonight, and just being a firefighter is dangerous. But for something like this to happen, like running into some crazy, wild hillbilly or satanic butcher man in the woods, that's just crazy. That's completely crazy. But you never know what's in the woods. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Share me with your friends and, as always, spread me around like butter. Have a good night and stay scary.